Thank you. All right. Well, in the interest of time, we will get started. So welcome everybody to the Considering Advanced Building Technologies in Distribution System Planning. This is one of our webinars in the NARUC NASIO LBNL Distribution System Planning peer sharing webinar series. And we're excited to delve into the coordination between building technologies and distribution system planning here today in a minute. So if you want to go to the next slide, the agenda we have for you today is we'll have, as usual, a few NASIO and NARUC introductory slides giving you an overview of some of the resources that we have. And then we're really looking forward to having a presentation from Abhishek Jain from ICF, looking at some of the emerging best practices for advancing building technologies and distribution system planning. And then I'm very excited to hear from two states, from Schuyler, Matteson from the New York Department of Public Service, and then Ari Zwick from the Minnesota Department of Commerce. So having a PUC and a State Energy Office perspective, as we usually do during these webinars. We will have ample time of questions and answers with the subject matter experts today. We'll have a facilitated discussion, but as you all are listening to the presentations, please think of your own questions, your own examples from your states, and feel free to put them in the chat, or we can get to the questions during the Q&A, raise your hand, etc. We're hoping to make this as lively as possible on this Monday afternoon. Next slide, please. So for those of you who don't know NASIO, we're the National Association of State Energy Officials. We are the nonprofit association that represents the governor-designated state energy offices from the 56 states and territories and the District of Columbia. And we provide resources to our members, and we advance the interests of our members before Congress and the administration. And if you want to learn more, you can go to our website. And next slide, please. There is a number of NASIO resources. One that has been accompanying us throughout this webinar series is our NASIO distribution planning training for state energy offices, which we have on our website. If you want to learn a little bit more about the fundamentals, you can go there. We also have a companion publication that we did together with LBNL on distribution planning for state energy offices. That's also on our website. But our newest publication that I wanted to highlight is our 2026 National Standard Practice Manual. That really delves into benefit cost analysis for distributed energy resources. There is going to be an open benefit cost analysis tool that is accompanying this manual going to be released over the summer. And you can find both of those on the website. I'll put the links in the chat momentarily. And we will also have some trainings going forward that can provide you more information on both of those tools. Before I will turn it over to NARUC, I just wanted to make sure to thank our supporters for the series, the U.S. Department of Energy Office of Electricity, as well as the Building Technologies Office. They've been instrumental in supporting the series and have been really helpful. So thank you so much. And with that, I will turn it over to Jeff from NARUC.
Thank you, Kirsten. Welcome, everybody. We love partnering with NASIO and Berkeley Lab on resources such as this for our members, the utility commissioners and state utility commission staff across, I'm sorry, I don't have the exact number of states, territories, and other associated organizations, but I think it's probably at least 56. Like with NASIO. We've got a number of resources related to distribution system planning that we've been producing, again, typically in collaboration with NASIO and Berkeley Lab in the past few years. I will put a link to our webpage where you can find all of these. I probably should have also had a slide prepared, but we do have an event tomorrow, sort of in a related sphere of distributed energy resources and the interconnection of those resources to the grid. So if that's also an area of interest for yourself, I will put a link in the chat for the page for that current DER cohort. Unfortunately, that one is one that we are keeping only for our neighborhood members. So for our NASIO friends, I'm sorry, we're not collaborating on that one. But you can go to that website after the fact and find presentations and recordings from those events. That looks like Lisa just posted it in the chat. Thank you very much. And again, in a moment, I'll put the page in for the other distribution system planning resources. So I think without further ado, I think Abhishek is up next.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Let me get this screen sharing in order again. I'll give it one more second to load up. Perfect. Well, I'll get started here. Hello, everyone. I'm super excited for this conversation today. Um, just so excited about distribution system planning, talking more about buildings overall, especially when Kirsten gave a quick plug to the OpenBCA and NSPM efforts. It's something very close to my heart. So overall, it's just great to see all these efforts being coming together. For me, I'm a senior manager at ICF. I've been with ICF for over 5 years now. In these past 5 years, DER valuation has been my bread and butter. And, that started with benefit cost analysis, but now in 5 years later, it's really just more so much about where in distribution systems can DERs provide more value and taking the step further away from BCA into more systematic planning and orchestration of DERs has become so central. So I'm super excited to be talking to you today. Ashwarya Padankar couldn't join, but she has been instrumental in helping me put this presentation together. Just wanted to make sure she get the credit where it's due. Um, for our presentation today, I wish to cover these three topics of why. Firstly, does building site data matters for distribution system planning? A case for grid utilization, as I'm sure all of you have heard of this word, this concept pop up everywhere in this forum and beyond, and then how forecasting and solutions can be empowered through data that can be enabled through buildings that exist. Um, Before I dive into this concept here, these topics are very nuanced, and something we were discussing with Lisa earlier as well, that this is a hard topic. I want to acknowledge that right at the outset. A lot of these things are new. There are very few examples out there. So, a lot of what we'll go into today is essentially value that's on the table, discuss some examples that we are seeing out there, and we'd love to hear from you as well, where you're seeing this or in what ways and forms you'd like to see these be implemented in the near future as well. So, today's topic is narrow, but it is focused, and I hope to talk through what this data essentially empowers for all of you. So, first, let's clarify what do we actually mean by building site data. We're talking about telemetry technologies, for example, technologies that can provide telemetry data behind the meter, like smart thermostats, heat pumps, water heaters, smart panels, and other connected data. This data can show a lot of things, but just to give you a few examples, through smart technologies, you can essentially see HVAC run times from heat pumps. You can see device level load. You can see smart thermostat set point temperatures coming from the smart thermostat devices itself. You can see equipment performance through commercial BAS systems, so on and so forth. There is a lot of data that exists out there, and that is what we are going to talk about essentially when we say building site data. Now, this data already exists. It is not a new thing. This data has been here since these technologies have been there, and utilities have often used this for demand side management, program design, and implementation, as well as evaluation efforts. So it's not that the fact that even the data integration is missing, the data link is there. It is rather fragmented right now. So while not commonly used in distribution system planning, comprehensive access is still limited. What you see on this slide is the traditional planning inputs on the left, such as feeder head SCADA, distribution system constraints, GIS data. These are very important data, which is essentially helpful for your traditional planning efforts. But now, when you see things on the right, is how building site data can help distribution planners through operational flexibility. There's two key themes that stand out to me, which is load allocation and load disaggregation. load aggregation becomes important because, and sorry, load allocation becomes important to planners as they can finally see what's behind the mass load. So let's say when you are planning for a full load, you may need to see what kind of load the system would have to serve if a particular DER or any demand side intervention through a program does not perform as existed. So load allocation becomes very important in those planning contextual cases as well. So it's fine tuning for solutions today. It is using your AMI data for operational planning forecast through tools like LoadSeer that you may have come across. Uh, and load disaggregation helps you with better forecasts whenever possible as well. So you get that granularity behind the meter. You can see what building capacity and performance there is, and you can design programs with it as well. So in this bottom flow chart that you see, starting with advanced building technologies all the way down to downward pressure on investments in new infrastructure, this is something that I would propose to you as an iterative step. It looks linear, but what I would really consider it is just something you go from step one to step three. You may have to come back to step two, but it's an iterative process where program design can help you better evaluate settings and controls. You can essentially see change in building performance. And overall, for a planning context, it should lead to enhancing operational efficiency. And I'll get into what are those different levers for operational efficiency we have today. But that's the overall goal of why this data matters and where in distribution planning efforts it can be leveraged for what benefits, mainly towards enhancing operational efficiency, which should lead to downward pressure on investments for new infrastructure. Now, grid utilization, I really felt important to just tie this into the narrative given everything that is going on out there. We've all come across grid utilization as this fancy new metric out there, and I thought it's important to kind of link it to this discussion because grid utilization and flexibility go together. Uh, the core point here is that improving grid utilization is not just a matter of adding controls or launching program. It depends on the data and forecast to know where flexibility can actually reduce constraint. Utilization, however, needs to be asset specific and time varying. And that doesn't mean that for the same transformer and downstream feeders and laterals, it all will align, right? The asset specific and time varying elements across each and every piece of infrastructure can be different, and how you measure utilization across those boards also change. So the part where this really ties into grid utilization as well as load flexibility is that in order to improve grid utilization, you are trying to solve by reducing short peaks. As short peaks can make assets constrained at specific hours, but on average, these assets may be underutilized, right? So grid utilization's aim is to increase this utilization, but you may need more headroom at those peak capacity places. And that's where load flexibility can play a key role. I think there's been a lot of good research over the past few years where we've sort of spoken more about this topic. So that's why I think grid utilization and load flexibility are key pieces, and both of these can be empowered using good building design data during planning efforts as well. So there are a bunch of questions here which sort of can help you think about what grid utilization means to you. But I would just sort of encompass this that again, grid utilization, it is no one metric as you'll see in the example next slide. And thinking about grid utilization, one should also think about load flexibility and how both of those again can be empowered through building site data. This is a very recent example, and it has been, like I said, visible in more policy and regulatory discussions. Virginia's HB 434 is one such example, where it asks utilities to measure, report, and improve grid utilizations, including through non-wire alternatives as well. The practical takeaway that I'd have for you here is that utilization potential improves when localized peaks are reduced, and that's a lot to unpack here. But by improving localized peaks, you're just making more headroom available to improve grid utilization assets. You're essentially increasing the potential of how utilization can be involved. So while Virginia has sort of given a lot of examples of how this can be done, there are a lot of metrics as you're seeing on the screen. On the right, on the left, you're sort of seeing some process that can be done through grid utilization. So this is one of the very few examples that we're seeing out there to think about how grid utilization can play a role. But like I said, when you think about this in the context of building side data, a lot of this building side data can help you essentially put numbers to these metrics and figure out how things can be improved by leveraging those buildings by directly incorporating that data available. Now, so what do we distribution planners actually need from building technologies? Firstly, you need the location. So of course, we already have data about the premise, right? Which how does that premise interact with the feeder, and how does that interact with the transformer? This data is already available. But now, if you take that a further level further with resolution, right? So if you can get building level data on an hourly or sub-hourly basis, this can be aligned with feeder and transformer peaks. So you are not planning towards just a singular coincident peak. Through more hourly and sub-hourly data, you can essentially look at localized peaks as well as system level peaks and understand how load differs in those two different settings, because their difference can be massive in a lot of cases. Thirdly, one thing that I find particularly exciting is end reuse attribution. Through this hourly data and just through looking at various technologies on buildings level, you can understand whether the load is HVAC dominated, is it water heating, is it end use, plug load, storage, energy storage. It can be a lot of various things in there. So by just understanding what that load is encompassing, you can understand the mask load from a planning perspective, and you can essentially understand how operational potential, what achievable potential could look different across different feeders. So, for example, while you're doing some planning, if you come across a feeder where you can see it's a lot of residential HVAC end use, your efforts can be more targeted towards improving flexibility in that scenario versus if there's a feeder which has more CNI-based loads, more interruptible interventions can be helpful in using that in your planning context. So this is just not connecting distribution planning with demand side management. It's essentially empowering both of those together through end use attributions. And finally, the most important part, which I think someone who interacts a lot with distribution, DSM folks a lot, that planners need measure time varying impacts, not assumed shapes, more precise data. So essentially, measured impacts over time, including persistence and confidence level. The goal is to move from conservative efforts to evidence-based decisions. So with that, I think building side data has unlocks a very big use case to move beyond just assumed shapes towards more real-time data, which planners can essentially trust. Now, I know we've been talking a lot very in abstract terms of distribution planning as well as building side data. So I just wanted to kind of connect the dots between what type of data is available from these advanced building technologies and what kind of distribution planning end uses or use cases you can essentially find them helpful to. So on the left, you can see that, this is the data that we've collected working with our demand response implementation partners. From a battery system, you can see sort of in real time, real power, reactive power, state of charge, voltage, current, all sorts of data for heat pump water heaters. Again, you can sort of see water temperature, thermostat set point, surge capacity, all of these sort of information data. So this information is out there. And, for a lot of your cases where you may be running DSM programs, you probably already have a link up to all of this sort of data coming in through APIs. And using a lot of these data in your distribution planning use cases, we just spoke about grid utilization assessment as one of them, but I think improving granular load forecasting or doing more localized demand response, hosting capacity improvements, DR detection, feeder and transmission overage detection, overall resiliency support at the edge, I feel are distribution planning use cases which can be tied in together using a lot of this data together. Now, what do we exactly mean by that? I thought I would play around with a thought experiment with you here. What schematics here you're seeing are essentially some outputs that we have from a SIME model, and we want to show you why this data granularity matters. So, with only SCADA data, the feeder may appear constrained because we see aggregated peak load at the source, right? So, when you're sort of seeing things here on the left, you're seeing that there's a feeder that appears constrained from a feeder source, However, when you tie in AMI data, so that's sort of the second layer of data, you can sort of localize this issue now because AMI empowered you to see where downstream on from that feeder source that peak or that constraint may be being experienced. And now, if you sort of factor in that third layer of insight, which is sort of the building level insights, it, it can actually show you which loads are driving the peak and whether the issue is limited to a short window, as in, it may be from just between 6 to 9 p.m., or it is a broader issue as well. And that data, when it comes from building site, can give you more access, more levers to pull in planning context. So that changes the planning question from whether the whole feeder is constrained to where and when the action is needed, because sometimes it's just about a question of when rather than if the upgrade is needed and where it's needed. So, with that additional insight, I think the solution set itself changes. If the issue is localized and time specific, planners may be able to consider flexible solutions rather than broad infrastructure upgrades. Again, this all perhaps sounds similar to non-wise alternative, but I would say this is a step above it where this becomes a practice from a day one perspective to improve your operational efficiencies and beyond. Building level data helps identify which customers, devices, or end users could provide meaningful relief during this peak window. And the point here is not that flexibility always replaces wires, but that better data allows utilities to test that option with more confidence. And I think I'll say with more confidence with emphasis because I realize that's one of the things planners need is better data and more confidence in that data as well. There are very few examples, like I said earlier on this case, that come to mind about data integration or sort of taking it into the next level using that data in various distribution planning use cases. But there were a few that I wanted to highlight here. I'm sure there could be a few more, and we'd love to hear from you if I have missed out on any examples. But there's a prominent one in New York through the Integrated Energy Data Resource (IDER) program, where essentially it's a statewide platform where data, energy related data is collected. It's a pretty cool website. You should go check that out. In fact, there's a tool out there, the EAIT, I think it's spelled out here as well, the Energy Infrastructure Assessment Tool, which is sort of a map-based visibility into utility upgrades and hosting capacity maps analysis. So very cool data. Again, this is even step one into using advanced building technologies and distribution system planning that is enabling the data itself. And I think the IDER program does a good job at that. There's a good example by Portland General Electric in Oregon where sort of they tied in using AMI data, performing RESTOC based analysis into disaggregating end use loads, which was really interesting, and sort of tying it with a residential appliance survey as well to get equipment data on heating and cooling, which was very helpful. Another New York example is the coordinated grid planning process, this TGPP, which sort of directs utilities for a more proactive planning framework, which moves beyond just sort of system level forecasting to more granular forecasting as well. A lot of this is ongoing as well, so we do not have a lot to share out on it. But there are good examples out there. Finally, one really good example back in 2023, I believe Kevala published this study, which I think sort of made a lot of noise in the industry as well. But they sort of built this bottom up analysis, which started with premise level all the way up to a feeder level to system level to see what kind of electrification scenarios trigger different distribution system level upgrade costs. And I think that's a good example to just understand or get a vision of what a future planning process may look like when building site data is incorporated into this. So, like I said, I believe this list may not be exhaustive, but it's a good list to give you few examples to study what's probably out there. And we're very curious to hear from all of you as well if you're seeing other data that could be helpful in this. So, to finally just round us out, I think there are a lot of implications for forecasting and investment decisions, which building site data and logs. The the most prominent one, of course, is better load forecasts. Measured time varying building data captures how and when load occurs, and this is very different from deemed savings from assumed load shapes. Overall, it can be a process which lowers your risk over or under building infrastructure, and then most importantly, it gives you that granularity and hence for the confidence in decision making. So again, this does not replace traditional planning, but it does tend to make planning more precise and data driven, which is something all of us want. To close this section and my presentation as well, the value of advanced building technologies is not just the devices themselves. Their value comes from the data that they provide and how that data further improves planning. When building technologies improve forecast accuracy, locational insight, grid utilization, and confidence in investment decisions, they become directly relevant to distribution planning. So that is the reframing. Customized site technologies are not only program assets, they can also be planning assets. So with that, I'll conclude my quick presentation here. Um, Super excited for the discussion later and to hear from the two states after this as well.
Great. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. Appreciate that overview. So we'll turn it now over to Schuyler Matteson from the New York Department of Public Service for a perspective from New York.
Great, thank you. Just checking that you can hear me and see my screen.
Yes, both.
Perfect. Well, that was a lot of great information, and I think whoever put this together knew what they were doing, because we are kind of fitting together just like puzzle pieces with this presentation. We're basically going to be able to walk through a very state-specific implementation of exactly what Abhishek was just talking through. So what I want to do is kind of walk you through the story of what's happening in New York State, and even give a couple examples of our planning processes and how we're trying to approach this kind of incorporating advanced building information and forecasts into our distribution plans. So in New York State, what we're experiencing right now is similar to many places around the country, where we're seeing right now, and we're expecting the future, load growth all the way throughout our electricity system. And so that's all the way from people buying EVs and heat pumps in their houses and plugging in, to commercial industrial electrification, all the way up to large scale, large loads and industrial development. So when we have a high level of that electrification, we're going beyond historical norms, right? Where for the last 20 or 30 years, my parents' level of electrification would have been switching out from a CRT TV to, a different type of television and HD TV, which in some cases might have saved electricity. Some people buying, a second freezer, or buying a microwave or something like that, where houses are adding 50 to 100 kilowatts at a time, and that's 50 to 100 watts at a time. Where we're going now is people going from maybe not even having electricity, electric cooling, to going to a 4, 5, 6 kilowatt heat pump that provides heating and air conditioning. So we're seeing huge, chunky electrification all throughout the state. There's a lot of concentration of electrification happening in downstate New York, in and around New York City, and that's driven by state and local laws, in addition to local policies, national policies from businesses, and some incentive programs. And so when we're thinking about downstate New York, we already have the oldest electricity system in the world. That's very tough to manage and tough to plan for and tough to upgrade. And now we're having these massive changes happening there. So how do you address that? How, when all this is happening kind of at the same time in a very constrained area? We already know that building anything new in New York City is very expensive and very difficult to site. So expanding infrastructure is, I don't want to say a last resort, but it's certainly something you have to think extra hard about. So whenever we're looking at these distribution plans, especially in somewhere like Manhattan, where pretty much everything is undergrounded, and making any upgrades requires shutting down multiple blocks and digging up roads and putting new things underground, we really need to make sure that we are minimizing the amount of time and money we're spending on doing that, and also making sure that if we're doing that, that it's the right project at the right location. So how do you even know that it's going to be the right project, or how to minimize those issues? Well, the first thing comes from having better information. Abhishek just talked a lot about this, where a lot of these new technologies that are being installed, HVAC systems, hot water systems, EVs, they're controllable. And so they have the potential for a lot of load flexibility, and we have some amount of that quantified through our various proceedings in New York State, namely the State Energy Plan and the Coordinated Grid Planning process. And we've found that it's very good. It's very important to have that type of load flexibility. We're actually baking that in as an assumption that we're going to achieve a lot of this load flexibility because of how valuable it is. And we're going to kind of go to many, many lengths to make sure we achieve that type of load flexibility because it is so valuable when so much of your system is at the margin. So when we're in peaks, in peaky areas where we're getting, especially on distribution networks, close to feeder or substation limits, it's really important to have that type of load flexibility to minimize the amount of new upgrades you need. So what we've been trying to do, both through rate cases and generic proceedings, including the CGPP and the proactive planning proceeding, is to start comparing distribution planning scenarios the traditional way, where we just look at what are the current loads, what are the current system ratings, where is that expected to go, and what type of investments are needed in that scenario, versus scenarios where we enable those forecasted loads to have a certain amount of flexibility. And that amount of flexibility is kind of an assumption that we've developed based on studies from national labs, some past program data coming out of California and other places that already have more advanced demand management programs, and to try to really examine where on the system we have a lot of value for having that flexibility, and how much flexibility do we think we can have based on the types of loads that are actually being developed. So we found there's a couple of issues when you try to do this. So it's not just a simple, point and click, or you add a couple of data points to your planning process, then everything's taken care of. The situation kind of comes with two major challenges. The first one is a timing issue, where on the distribution network, utilities typically like to have at least a year to study everything. And if they find something they need to build, they need 3 to 5 years to build that thing. That is not at all the way load actually is developing nowadays. These big loads can come in overnight. I can go out and buy an EV today, and my neighbors could do the same thing. And you go from having a neighborhood block that has an average house load of 3 kilowatts, and you immediately jump the next day to an average house load of 10 kilowatts. That's a huge change that is not in typical forecasts, especially on these very localized systems. So system upgrades can take a long time, but system growth does not take very much time at all. So there's this kind of timing disconnect that we have to solve for and make sure that our programs and our plans are accounting for. The second major issue is this, something I've kind of already touched on, where there's this size and granularity issue. Electrification is coming in big chunks nowadays. It's not like a smooth kind of adoption of a new technology where people are switching from like radios to TVs or something, or adding extra lights to their house. We're having huge chunk loads coming in, where people switching from, say, natural gas heating to a 5 kilowatt heat pump overnight. That's a big change, and so we need to make sure we're staying ahead of that. And then the granularity issue is that those loads are not happening everywhere all at once necessarily. These big chunky loads are actually just dropping into a single point on a feeder, or a kind of a single node inside of a broader system. And you actually need to know where that is. These traditional approaches of kind of adding up all the load growth you expect to have in your service territory and spreading it proportionally across your system, that doesn't work. That peanut butter approach is dead. We have to get away from that, because that almost guarantees you will both underinvest in certain areas and overinvest in others. And so when we look at our system, especially in New York State and especially in downstate New York, our system is basically near the margin, meaning most of our components of our system within this planning horizon look like they're going to need some form of work, either in an investment in the physical infrastructure itself, or a program to manage the demand to make sure we don't need to make that investment. So our solution to that has been to launch proactive planning. So we're going beyond just traditional planning, and we're going beyond just kind of static planning and seeing what value flexibility can have, all the way to, okay, let's forecast all the changes that are happening in the system. Let's get really good data on where those loads are growing, exactly who is buying EVs, where and when will heat pumps be developed, where and when are these economic development loads expected to come in, and placing them very specifically on the network, and then planning scenarios around that to identify where exactly these things are going to show up, comparing those to scenarios where we allow load flexibility, and see what type of investments we need to make. So in the proactive planning proceeding, which I have here, the matter number, if anybody wants to search it, I would say go to Google and type it in. They actually have a better search than the Public Service Commission website. So if you want to just search the matter number 24E0364 or just DPS proactive planning, it'll take you there. That's where we're doing all this work to have the utilities construct these better, more granular electrical forecasts of this load growth, primarily driven by building electrification and EVs. So we're telling them through that proceeding that you now have to go out and incorporate forecasts of distributed energy resources, building electrification, load flexibility at end users, and put those both into the load forecasts to make sure we're identifying the impacts on the system, but also keep them in your back pocket as a way to add them to a solution set. If you do find an issue on your system where you need an upgrade, you can actually use additional load flexibility or new programs or new DERs as a solution. Now, as Abhishek said, this is a lot of data from a lot of other places. So what we've had to do is kind of work with sister organizations, both NYSERDA, Empire State Development, which is our economic development arm, and industry groups. And I'm thinking specifically of some of our building industry groups and our DER industry groups that have data and have some forecasts of where their customers and their industry groups are expecting deployments to happen, and just getting as much data to the utilities as possible so we can figure out where the technology is going to go, what are their capabilities, and how are we going to build these programs and plans to make sure we're incorporating those into our planning forecasts. Any existing or planned load flexibility then gets incorporated into the base case load forecast, which allows us to, in both the CGBP and the proactive planning proceeding, allows us to see what the world looks like and what investments are needed when we already have load flexibility. If we select those scenarios and we try to enable programs that, say, use hot water heaters, more effectively, and incorporate managed charging and cycle heat pumps in a certain way to minimize peak loads, that can now be our base case and avoid infrastructure ahead of time. Like we don't even have to plan for those system upgrades because we're already planning on our forecasted load to be lower and our peaks to be lower in the first place, so we don't actually have to make those investments. So we're proactively avoiding investments. And then when we reach those areas in the state, especially downstate, where we are up against the wall, we have to make investments, we are now adding this new tool to our toolkit of additional load flexibility, managed charging, new demand response programs, for example, to actually avoid new investments. So basically, building traditional poles and wires and things are kind of our last step in the process. When we absolutely have to, that's going to be the decision we make. Now, that's not where it stops. Importantly, when we're putting these systems in our plans, and in the cases where we actually select these high load flexibility scenarios as our planning base cases for which we're actually identifying investments in, that means we are proactively assuming we defer the future investments. And now that might sound like kind of a risky place to be, and it kind of is, but when you have these targets and these goals and you have affordability top of mind, you kind of have to take that approach of a like massive capital projects are last in the bid stack type situation. And so we then switch our mindset to program design and incentive design to make sure that the DER deployment, the building electrification and demand response and demand side programs are designed in a certain way to give us what we are planning for. So if we look at the load forecast and we see, it's for these 3 hours during these seasons were the most important times to have this flexibility to avoid those investments, our programs have to make sure that the assets will show up then. And so this second bullet here is kind of making that point that you actually have to make sure you're not underpaying for the services that you're expecting from the market. We can't just tell people it would be nice that these 3 hours be avoided. There's a value to that. We might be avoiding hundreds of millions to billions of dollars of investments over the 15 to 20-year distribution plan, especially in New York City. And so that's a lot of money on the denominator of that BCA that you have to work with, where you can still save a lot of money for ratepayers, but still pay fairly rich incentives to folks to make sure that their assets are used flexibly to avoid system costs for everybody. So that might mean boosting the dollar per kilowatt value of a demand response program, or the monthly payment for a controllable thermostat program. But you have to make sure that those incentives are placed so that the adoption curve that you're assuming in your load forecast actually shows up. Because you actually could cause yourself some problems if you set those too low. People don't show up. You try to avoid an infrastructure project, and then you don't get enough, and you still need the infrastructure project. Now you're paying for both things, and you're kind of in a rough situation. But on the other hand, you also need to make sure that the people you're paying to show up to actually avoid this, they understand how to perform, and you understand what assets they're actually bringing to the table and how they perform. Managed charging with EVs is completely different than a controllable thermostat program, which is completely different than from a demand response program in terms of communication protocol, payments, value, shiftability, how persistent they're able to be. For example, I'm in a managed charging program up here in upstate New York. I have a preset on my phone that connects to my car, which just only charges my car at my house between off-peak hours of 11 p.m. and 7 a.m. I don't have to do anything, and that's a lot of shiftable hours, and it also is very persistent. It's going to happen every day no matter what. I don't have to do anything. So that's almost perfect persistence. That might not be the same case as, say, controllable air conditioners in high rises in New York City during a 5-day heat wave. You might see a dramatic drop in persistence after the third or fourth day, and people get really, really sick of being too hot. And so you have to think about that in terms of value that you're getting from resource adequacy and transmission security in your plans, and build that in up front. You don't want to be surprised that you got way lower performance than you were expecting. And this is where, as Abhishek mentioned, the more data we have, the more programs, the more studies we can do, the better, so that we can inform folks like us who are doing this. We can provide more data to the utilities, and we can all have a better sense of what we're going to get. And so that uncertainty goes down, and we can kind of plan for these a lot better. We have a lot of this work ongoing through both the Grid of the Future proceeding, the proactive planning proceeding, and the coordinated grid planning process. And so we're not, quote unquote, there yet, but I would point you to some of the work that's coming up in the proactive planning proceeding. There's a filing due on September 18th, where the utilities will be kind of posting their first granular forecasts here, as well as some investments that should include DERs and load flexibility as a kind of infrastructure investment avoider. And so there's going to be some really important and really interesting work there. And the Grid of Future proceeding that should have a filing early this summer, and then potentially again in the fall, outlining some of the plans for how to actually take advantage of load flexibility in the long term. So that's all for me, and I'm looking forward to the questions and discussion later.
Great. Thank you so much. And so impressive what's happening in New York. So we'll move westward and across the country to Minnesota. And Ari Zwick from the Minnesota Department of Commerce will tell us what is happening in Minnesota on considering advanced building technologies and distribution system planning. Just before you get going, Ari, just wanted to highlight in the chat that presentations and a recording of this webinar will be available online. And there's also a registration link for the August 13th webinar in the series, which will focus on stakeholder engagement requirements and practices. And again, a plug, if you have any questions, please put your questions in the chat. But Ari, over to you.
Hi, I'm Ari Zwick. I'm an analyst with the Minnesota Department of Commerce, and I work on regulatory dockets in front of the commission, and I've been involved in distribution plans and on the generation side too in integrated resource plans. So I have a bit of a unique perspective on the integration of those two, although not a ton of overlap in this area. So I'm coming at this from a little different perspective from the previous two presentations, where it's more of like a lay of the land and what energy efficiency and demand response looks like in Minnesota, and it's pretty messy, and specifically how that ends up on the distribution system. So like in the middle, we have the energy conservation and optimization program, the ECO program. That's where all of the incentives come out, mostly for like the standard light bulbs and efficient heating and cooling, et cetera. And so that's like where we think about energy efficiency and demand response traditionally. And so it makes its way on the right side into integrated distribution plans, but it's not a focus by any stretch. It's sort of uh, presented, but a lot of this ends up in there's a triennial process where all the utilities file plans on what they're going to do for the next 3 years, and they get their programs approved, et cetera. And so a lot of that happens in the eco docket, and then they just report it in the integrated distribution plan. So the point is that most of the work that's being done doesn't actually make it into the distribution plans. And then there are all of these other processes that are going on related to energy efficiency and demand response that can also potentially affect the distribution system. But I think the important thing to highlight is that we don't really have a distribution centered planning process around advanced building technologies. So as I talk about some examples of existing programs, they're all pretty much directed at the wholesale power market and not so much directed at distribution system needs. So if there's a program to curtail energy, for example, then they're going to do that on a MISO emergency day, which might never happen. And there are other programs where they might cycle them more, but a lot of this is really centered on wholesale market participation, particularly for demand response. And some of our other utilities, I think, use it more than others, and it's program specific. And so like in our transportation electrification plans, those can land up in the eco program, or they can be in a separate process in an integrated resource plan. We'll have the the statutory limit for what a utility expects for energy efficiency, and then they'll study packages of enhanced energy efficiency or enhanced demand response that could then get approved if it's found to be cost effective, and that could go into the eco program or it could go somewhere else. And then we have on the left the Natural Gas Innovation Act, which is a newer development, and that is trying to run pilots to decarbonize the natural gas system, and that is a completely separate program. So we just have stuff all over the place. Like there could be heat pumps or demand control in all of these, and so it's just hard to keep track of everything. And I won't read through all of this. It's mostly a disclaimer on how our eco program works as the heart of where most of these programs land, that the Minnesota Department of Commerce, where I worked, although not in my unit, administers the eco program. The utilities submit their eco plans, and then the department develops a multiple frameworks and standards for how programs get approved, and ultimately they have to get approved by the department, and then the Public Utilities Commission weighs in sometimes on which programs should get considered for eco and things like that. And then in 2021, the ECO Act was passed, and that opened the door for fuel switching, which is making it more prominently into utility planning, but is kind of just still pretty new. And our biggest utility in Minnesota is Xcel Energy. My understanding is this, I'm talking about a lot of subjects that I don't actually work in. So if I might be saying some things that are not entirely accurate, but this one I did check is the Xcel Gas and Electric Eco Triennial Plan. And so the dark bar at the bottom is the megawatt savings. This is from a 2023 filing, so everything after that is a projection. But Xcel is anticipating saving around 200 megawatts a year, which is pretty substantial, especially over the course of a few years. That's several power plants worth of generation. So our program is pretty robust, and spending has been increasing, or at least projected to increase as of recently. Some of the existing programs that Xcel has is commercial AC control, and then they have some tariff filings, so the critical peak pricing is really just time of use, and all of our utilities are shifting over to time of use. So those are broader programs. And then like various rewards. So again, some of these programs are used more regularly, I think, but some of them are just like if there's an emergency day, then you get to use this, and they might not show up at all that year, and so they don't get triggered. And that's very important for distribution planning, because if you don't actually have these emergency days show up, then and your load shows up on that, for us, a hot day would be like 95, 100 degrees, then there might not be a MISO emergency day. The demand response doesn't kick in. You can't count on it being on the distribution system. And so like that's a big challenge for adopting any of this. If everything is getting dispatched for the wholesale power market and not on the distribution system, it has a very limited value for the services that it can deliver to the distribution system. So we have some newer, more geared towards advanced building technology developments. The first one is actually not, but it's very related. It's trying to achieve the same goal, and it's gotten some media attention, which is the Xcel Distributed Capacity Procurement Program. And that program is supposed to install 50 to 200 megawatts of Xcel-owned batteries on the distribution system, which are dispatched for MISO, the wholesale power market. And they're supposed to co-locate the batteries for benefits to distributed generation and for load on the distribution system. But again, the primary purpose is for dispatch in the wholesale power market, not to alleviate distribution grid needs. Now, those will get used ideally more often than in more of an emergency demand response program. But yes, that's tangential to the other things that I'll be talking about. And that program started in ECO, and now it's become its own separate program. Xcel has a vehicle to grid pilot with, I think, 2 or 3 school buses that is just getting started. I think it got approved 2 years ago. And there are, Xcel also has a managed charging, EV charging tariff, and that is supposed to be used to optimize for distribution capacity needs. So that's one of the more exciting ones. They'll actually start citing managed charging in areas that the distribution system needs and not just generation. And then we have 2 tariffs from 2 of our utilities for distributed battery systems, although at least for Xcel, I think they're not paying a ton of money, citing the previous presentation that if you're getting, I think it's like around $150 a year or something, and if you have to pay like $15,000 for your battery system, and they're going to cycle it like 60, 100 plus times a year and degrade your battery, does that make sense to let people use your battery system? I'm very curious about those questions of battery owners, how much they have to get paid to start using their assets. And this slide addresses how energy efficiency and demand response manifests in our actual planning processes. So on the eco side, it's more of a program approval. So a utility will submit a program. We want a controllable thermostat, hot water heater, et cetera. And then it goes through this eco framework. It has to go through a cost effectiveness test. And then if it gets approved, then they'll track how many devices received rebates, incentives, and then that's about where it stops. Like it doesn't make it into the distribution system planning process. It's a separate process. And that's why I opened with the first slide that a lot of this lives in a different area, and it doesn't really cross-pollinate with our distribution planning process. So it's more of a pass-fail kind of test of, and it's not necessarily like if you get a benefit cost ratio of 1, it's getting approved or not. There are other things that they consider, but that's where distribution grid benefits are measured when a program is going to be approved or not, is in the eco program. And then on the integrated distribution plan side, most utilities aren't looking at it in our state specifically. They're doing more of the traditional grid planning. What's the aggregate load at this feeder or substation? And they're just starting to track more than maybe what you'd see in the eco program, or again, they'll just report a lot of data from the eco program. And we do have a non-wires alternative process, and that's been pretty disappointing thus far on the number of projects that we've seen. And so I think we have like 2 or 3 projects at the RFP stage. And that's about all we've seen after several years of trying to get non-wires projects approved. And load seer is mentioned in the first presentation, and so that's one of the more interesting examples in Minnesota of what's happening. And load seer is an allocation model. So Excel takes their system-wide forecast and they input that into load seer to then geospatially allocate where they think all of these devices are going to show up, load growth, et cetera. Energy efficiency is part of the load seer model, whereas demand response is part of the system forecast. So energy efficiency gets its own forecast, and demand response is more of that gross system level dispatch. It'll show up in the load forecast. And basically what it's doing is it's projecting geospatially where it thinks all these devices are going to show up and load growth. And then it will give a feeder level substation level forecast of where it thinks load is or on that specific feeder. And so it is geospatially informed. Advanced metering infrastructure is like half in, half out. I'm not sure like exactly to the extent that it's been integrated, but it does use a ton of data, like SCADA data, which is they use in traditional planning, billing data, weather, and then they have a model of transformer and feeder capacity limits. And on the energy efficiency side, it's really hard to actually forecast where energy efficiency is going to show up because there might have been like a lighting project or an HVAC project that got installed in 2025 and the utility has no idea where it was. And so there's sort of limits on how you can geospatially forecast if you don't have the data on specifically where things were or are on your system. And so it makes it harder to say, oh, what are the factors that led to this load showing up or this load not showing up, because it's just noise. And this is just an output of what loads your forecast. So like on the top, the blue line is their base load, and then you'll have a forecasted load at some period of time. And so like if you exceed their planning limits, then that'll trigger upgrades. And this is their Excel's energy efficiency forecast that they use in loads here. There are individual forecasts for a lot of different loads like EVs and solar, et cetera. And so there's a lot of bottom-up forecasting in there that traditionally are at the Department of Commerce, we are very skeptical of. And that leads into my last slide, which is that as Excel adopted loads here around 2025. They presented it in 2023, but I don't believe, I might be wrong, but I don't believe they were actually using it in their system planning. Now they are. And so in 2025, we see this huge spike in the graph on the left of normalized utility spending. So basically how many dollars you're spending per megawatt hour that you're selling, normalized for inflation. And so we're seeing a 5-fold increase in distribution capacity needs. And we're asking a lot of questions about why this is happening and what planning processes are leading to that. And obviously, advanced building technologies are of great interest to try and alleviate this huge increase in spending. And so part of me looks at when load zero is adopted and their forecasts and says, how accurate is this new forecast that they're using? Because it is happening at the same time as we're seeing their budget balloon. And I know this is happening to one extent or another all over the country, but we're trying to get forecast accuracy metrics for loads here, and it's a black box. But there is a regression model embedded in there somewhere, and the load zero predict peak load on a feeder or a substation. And what you see is, oh, it's not 105 degrees like what's in loads here. It was actually only 93 degrees this year, and trying to reconcile those two things and all the other factors, economic growth, et cetera, of what could be driving load forecasting, it makes it very difficult to retroactively go back and say, oh, well, what if we adjusted the temperature down and we adjusted economic growth, et cetera, how accurate was this model? And so that's like a really hard question to answer, but it's just a very important one for me to get something out of that, because it is a new tool, and with new tools comes new uncertainty. You're sort of you have data to inform where these predictions are going to be located, but ultimately you could be introducing more noise into the model and projecting load growth that doesn't show up, which could lead to less accurate load projections if it's not controlled for properly. And that's sort of why we're looking at forecast accuracy. And so that's a big concern that we want to try and address as best as we can. So that's it for my presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Ari. I really appreciate that overview of what's happening in Minnesota. And we actually have a follow-up question for you. You mentioned the lack of non-wires alternative projects, and is this due to a lack of appetite from the utility, or is this more of a process issue in your opinion?
So I have a great example. We've been pushing utilities on NWAs for a while, and we could, what was I going to say? Like, no, I'll stop with that. But sorry, I lost my train of thought. Yeah, so basically, like one of our utilities, for example, does or is pursuing a reliability NWA. They're putting a battery on the end of a feeder line so they don't have to build a new line to have redundant capacity. And our other utility doesn't consider reliability projects in non-wires. And so advanced building technologies could be a non-wires solution as part of this framework, but it's an explicit framework for us where they study one by one and like project by project, is there an NWA here? And they screen out a lot of projects because there's just like some physical limitation or something else that the majority of them get screened out in all of our utilities. But where we have seen them, like I asked Excel in our last round, they use a 5-year deferral period. And I said, why are you using a 5-year deferral period? Why not 10 years or 8 years or 2 years? And they said, well, we actually used to do 10 years and our load forecasts were so big that we would have to size, like they're mostly battery and solar projects that they're looking at. They'd have to size these projects so much bigger than it would make sense, especially if they're just like Excel tries to snip just the value of the battery and solar for the distribution system and says, oh, the rest of it, somebody can find another source of revenue for. And even with all of these adjustments, I think they have 2 projects. And so there's just a lot of uncertainty in that planning horizon that makes it really challenging to pencil out anything. And so that's why we haven't really seen any.
That's great. Thank you for that. And again, to the audience, if you have any questions, we're going to go transition into the question answer period with Ari and Schuyler and Abhishek now. Please, feel free to put your questions in the chat. But I wanted to kind of ask you both, Ari and Schuyler, we have the state energy offices and PUCs online, and what levers can they kind of pull to improve consideration of advanced building technologies in the distribution system planning? What has worked well, what hasn't worked well, and what are some maybe innovative things you've seen?
Yeah, I think we had been kind of talking about this for a few years. We have very active like solar and storage and energy efficiency industries in our state. And so we've been kind of thinking around the margins here for years around how can we get even more value about these things, not just looking at customer value and, peak demand value, but like long-term, investment grade like analysis that shows the value of this thing of like advanced building technologies and load flexibility. We started by doing some of our own studies, but now as we got more comfortable knowing how to integrate these things and what to actually ask for, the commission has issued a number of orders directing the utilities to actually incorporate this data into their load forecasts, both as scenarios, but also as part of their baseline distribution plans. So they have to basically tell us exactly what's going into their load forecasts and how that's working. And then when they're looking at their investment plans, they actually also have to tell us whenever they're requesting funding for an investment, they also have to have done an assessment of whether NWAs or alternative technologies could have mitigated the challenge. So really, if you put it, we have to put some of the onus on the people doing the planning, because otherwise that's not really going to happen. So I think a lot of it is about the commissions themselves taking that step of kind of forcing this type of analysis and these types of moves into distribution service system plans.
Right. And Ari, maybe for the State Energy Office perspective.
Yeah, and I have a similar one. Like the very first thing is just getting data. So traditionally, our utilities were just like, oh, we did 1,000 heat pumps last year or whatever, but they don't know where they are. And so if you don't have that geospatial information, then you can't plan around it. Most of our utilities just aren't even looking at it. It's Excel is at the forefront. They have most of the load in our state. But so yeah, it's like data is number one, and also like a cautionary tale from us was there's a managed EV charging pilot, and they installed a bunch of EV chargers that were supposed to be controllable or at least like link up their data, and this company goes out of business. And so now they're requesting funding to rip out all those EV chargers and install new ones because they can't use them anymore. And so like maybe there's firmware concerns or something else. There's a lot of companies in the EV charging space, and in this field, I'm sure even more when you include everybody else like span and all that. And so like if someone goes out, then you still want to be able to use a device rather than being like, oh, well, this company went out of business and we can't use it, or it's not being upgraded. So interoperability is very important, and making sure that you can get life out of all of your assets. I'm also a big fan of like trying to do targeted NWA like studies for energy efficiency and demand response, and potentially enhance incentives. So our Excel program has some enhanced incentives for distribution constrained areas, I believe. And then we're also advocating for a pilot for there's the the program is called a Distributed Energy Resource Management System, and I didn't want to talk about it in our presentation because it doesn't really, there's like just getting started, but that's the software platform for all of the controllable load. And my understanding is that like there isn't a system to link front of the meter and behind of the meter assets. And so the behind the meter doesn't have the grid awareness part, and front of the meter doesn't have the control your thermostat part. And until those two systems merge, at least this is what we've been told, they can't actually start using like highly geo-targeted systems. Like the utilities can physically do it. Like they can send the signal at the substation, like turn off your thermostat or your water heater, but they can't include that in their planning for capacity needs. And so they just don't do it. And until they have these systems in place, then nothing is happening. And so like working towards a distributed energy resource management system is very important. And then our last one was just, we're asking for a pilot in advance of those systems coming, which sound like they're several years away because they're being built off of legacy demand response programs. And I forget what the legacy version for front of the meter resources is, but I think there's one for that too. And so they have to like merge these two software systems. But in preparation for that, we're asking for a proactive pilot to say, okay, take a few feeders and let's start piloting different incentive levels and different device types, and start collecting this data so that when the software becomes available, we can hit the ground running and start incorporating this. I'd rather not see it in a non-wires program, just into standard utility planning processes. And yeah.
Great. I appreciate the perspectives from New York and from Minnesota very much. But the others on the call also represent a number of state energy offices